I'm Father Pollman.
And I'm Father Schumacher.
And this is
A Closer Look. I'm Father Schumacher.
And I'm Father Pollman.
And today we're going to take a closer look at church architecture. Church architecture. This is the structure of a church. Does it matter? What is church architecture, Father?
Well, I think that's a great question. If we look at some of the older churches or drive down even the highways of St. Louis, there's a very clear distinction between what we can tell as a church versus other homes in the area. And, we actually have this an inheritance from the forefathers in the faith, the Hebrew worship in the temple. And so the Hebrew temple had a reflection of the cosmos. So there is this connection between divine worship and the way that God arranged creation. And that was very significant to the Hebrews and apparently to God who made it. So, and we know that Moses had that replica of divine worship from that vision on Mount Sinai. So the divine worship is not something that's made up, and so even the architecture that we have for sacred worship is something that's been received and a certain inspiration that has an effect on us.
Right, and as the author to the Hebrews, right, says that the letter to the Hebrews talks about Moses receiving a copy of the heavenly worship. So it's like straight out of heaven, we get this pattern, although obviously kind of appropriate for human condition on earth.
Yeah.
So we got, you get the tabernacle, the Mosaic tabernacle, which at the time of David and Solomon becomes this grand, temple in stone and wood, right?
Yes. You have the Holy of Holies, which is that place that no one was to enter into except for the high priest once a year. And within that you had the Ark of the Covenant. And so the Ark of the Covenant had the manna from heaven, the staff of Aaron, and the Decalogue or the Ten Commandments. So we have this fulfillment in Christ in the tabernacle in our churches. He is the true bread from heaven. He is our high priest, and he is the Word of God. So we have a tabernacle, just like there is the Holy of Holies in the temple. And there were veils with embroidered cherubim on the curtains that were to separate us. And that evokes actually the cherubim that was set to keep us out of paradise once Adam and Eve had sinned. And so there's this liturgical expression when the priest enters into the sanctuary that we've regained access and that paradise is in the process of being restored.
Wow. Yeah, so this most sacred place is the kernel, the center, the anchor of our worship. In fact, in the ancient Jewish practice, obviously not everyone lived in Jerusalem or where the tabernacle was before the temple was built. And yet they still oriented their worship toward this center of worship. So the synagogues often had a little marker on the wall to indicate where Jerusalem is, and the people would face that direction in order to pray. Does it matter? God can hear us wherever we are and whatever direction we're praying. And yet it's good for us to have that orientation toward the physical place of his divine condescension to be with us. He's the one who has made his presence available to us. And so we orient ourselves to that presence.
To this day, the Jews still pray towards Jerusalem, if I'm not mistaken. Well, for us Christians, we are the one monotheistic religion that doesn't pray to an earthly location. We actually orient ourselves literally facing towards the east.
The origin of that was because Christ says that the Son of Man will return as lightning lights up the sky. From the east to the west it is seen. So we look for the return of our Lord, his glorious return, from the east. Now, we don't know exactly what that means, because he says that all people will see him all at once. There's not going to be some kind of progressive finding of him, as there was in the first coming. And yet, Christians from the very earliest days had this intuition that we ought to be facing toward the east as if we are standing there waiting for him. In fact, it was one of the very early controversies that we have records of about whether we should face the east because that's where the sun comes from, or if it turns out that the house they were celebrating Mass in had a window in the room that they were celebrating Mass in that didn't face east, should they face toward the window because that was where the light was coming from? So the symbol of the light. Was it more important to face the east or toward the light? And the actual response was that it was more important to face toward the east than it was toward to face toward the light itself. So the early Christians took this very seriously, this orientation, this physical orientation.
So it seems like, based on what we're talking about then, that when people ask, does it matter to God, that's maybe the wrong question.
Mm-hmm.
Does it make a difference to me? Does it impress upon me an effect that is good for me, especially when I'm praying to God? And it seems to me that we're already hinting at the answer being yes.
Right. Well, and you hinted a little bit before about this, the physical structure of our church, our space of worship, is to demonstrate the divine ordering of things, that we receive an order from God, that we instantiate by means of human art in different ways. So this ordering is, as I say, given by God, and we instantiate it, for example, in things like building churches that have kind of a rectilinear direction, right? Churches that don't have direction become church buildings that don't have direction become kind of this open space that doesn't impress upon us the fact that we are part of this order that is progressing toward the final consummation at the end of the age. The symbolism of the rectangular church with the kind of people in ranks was very deliberately based upon the ancient navies, with the sailors, the rowers, kind of in their benches in ranks, and they're all facing the forward direction so they can all pull together and move the whole boat together as one toward its goal.
So two things become obvious to me through this. One, that's why that rectangular part of the church is called the nave.
Navis is Latin for boat.
So people sit in the nave. It also indicates then that if I'm sitting in a pew, facing towards kind of in the direction that this boat is going, and in this case, the compass then is figured or directed eastward, then I'm not just sitting in a pew. It means that I'm actually someone, by my prayers and sacrifices in my very life, is helping to run this ship to its course. That's beautiful.
It is beautiful. It's a symbolism in the very structure of the place that when you are just in your place in church, you're part of a body, a part of a group that is working on a common goal.
I'll be honest, when I was in the Holy Land on a pilgrimage, the one thing that finally dawned on me is why, one, that Jesus was in a boat a lot, and two, why the naval imagery was so apparent to the Christians from the very beginning.
Yeah.
So perhaps can we talk about then, if there are these objective realities, we see things we call sacred architecture. And there's more than one kind. I think probably a favorite of ours is Gothic. And you have all of these transcendent lines lifting the mind and heart along with the eyes upward to heaven. But then you've also got the kind of the Roman architecture that we inherited from the earliest days as well. Could you maybe say something as far as why they're sacred and yet why there's even variety in these?
Right. So first of all, architecture is practical. It is to fulfill a practical purpose, which is to put a roof over our heads, right? We need an altar in order to offer the sacrifice, and in order to protect the sacred action from the elements, we need a roof. That's the basics of it, which is why the first Christians just celebrated Mass in their homes. They just had, a small congregation of people, and this space already was available to them. But it became obvious that, as the congregations became bigger, and even without a large congregation, it's appropriate to build a space that is dedicated for the purpose. Okay, well, if you're going to do that, then the space you build ought to speak in its very form of the action that it is encompassing. So, as you pointed out, the Gothic architecture, has lines and angles that orient us upward. That's important. We'll get back to that in a moment because that's actually a later development. As you pointed out, the
Yes.
Roman architecture, the Romans were genius engineers, and they built these grand buildings called basilicas, meant literally the royal hall. Basilico is a Greek adjective that means royal. A basilica was the royal hall, the royal meeting hall. And they were built in such a way that there was a grand hall with a raised platform at the front, kind of like a stage, if you want to think of it that way, where the official would hold meetings. It served as the court, it served as the meeting hall. It could be, commercial transactions, all of these kind of things. Anything that had to be done publicly was done in a place like this so that it could be seen to be done publicly. So the congregation would be in the hall part, down on the floor, and up on the platform would be the official and anyone doing business with him. This is where speeches would have been given. This is where lots of different things would have happened. The Christians understood this is a great model for how to build churches so that the liturgical action can be visible, can be done publicly. And it is following upon that royal model, that this is the royal official on his business.
And before you go on with this, I think it's good to keep in mind, we inherited Roman architecture, and as Christians, we perfected it. Mm-hmm. So whereas the Romans had pillars, they tended to just kind of erect them all over the place. So there are certain principles that, rightly understood, need to be brought into balance. So when you see straight lines, that actually represents the masculine, and the curvatures actually represent the feminine, such that the Roman pillars, with all of these gorgeous archways, represent a perfect harmony between the masculine and the feminine.
Yeah, so the Romans, again, architecture is practical. It's serving a purpose. The arches, they understood, they learned that they're really good for holding things up. It's very strong, very strong structure, very strong form. And yet, as you point out, that there's this kind of symbolic meaning behind it too, which the Christians deliberately incorporated. So that became, the basilica style became what's called Romanesque, which is this rectangular shape with a raised platform at the front, lots of round arches. The Gothic style is a new development from this. In fact, it wasn't called Gothic by the people who used it. It was called goodness, now I'm forgetting exactly what it was called. They didn't call it Gothic. Gothic was a later name applied to it. But they understood it to just be a development of what they already had. And the development was, again, in a certain sense, it was practical. They noticed that actually it's not a round arch that has the best structural capacity. It's actually a pointed arch. If you know a little bit about your mathematics and your engineering, a catenary curve is the structure, is the curve that is the most gravitationally stable. Our arch here in St. Louis is a catenary curve, and it holds itself up perfectly with the load being perfectly distributed. So a Gothic arch more perfectly approximates this catenary curve. And, as you say, the Christians perfected something, or they understood it to be not just practical, but also symbolic. The point of it actually, in its very form, points us upward. If you've ever been to some of these great Gothic churches that we have, for example, here in St. Louis or elsewhere in the world, many of the lines of them are not forward so much as they're upward. The rectangle of the nave leads us inward, and then you see the front of the nave, so your eyes are drawn forward by the very lines of the nave, and as you get to the front of the church, a good Gothic church will actually point you upward. So I'm thinking especially of the grand altar at St. Francis de Sales. Massive wooden altar piece that just points you upward, and your eyes are automatically drawn upward. So the church draws you in and then up. A good church has to have this vertical element because we're not just here to gather. We're not just here to have human intercourse. We're here to have worship of the divine, to be brought up into this divine dynamic. It's something that comes down from heaven and leads us back up to heaven. And if it stays here on this earth, then it's worthless. I mean, we may as well give it up. St. Paul says, if Christ isn't risen, your faith is in vain. If there is no resurrection, if there's no end in heaven, there's no point to all of this. And a good church ought to instantiate that idea in the very form of the architecture.
Yeah. So not only so there you have the symbolic, you have the practical, and frankly, you have what is truly beautiful. There's a lot of things that, even though we're taking a closer look, we would have to dedicate separate times to a number of other things related to this. But I just want to give you some idea of everything else that feeds into sacred architecture. The acoustics. With right proportion, the acoustics reverberate, and this was a later discovery and development by the monks, that sacred architecture, rightly proportioned, the voice carries in a way that is perfectly harmonious. So again, we don't really have time to go into overtones, but how it all works so perfectly with how the nature of acoustics works. That's only one other aspect to this. The Gothic architecture, but you also have this with the Roman as well, and others. The pillars that we might think just got in the way of the vision to the sanctuary. Again, there's this replication of nature in perfect harmony, so that if we have the restoration of the garden that I mentioned at the beginning, there's this, especially with the Gothic architecture, this kind of imagery of a perfectly ordered forest that we are living in. And I would speculate on this, but I even wonder if getting away from that sacred architecture is why more people have wanted to get married outside rather than in a church.
Right. It's interesting that so much of the late 1900s and now the 21st century, often suburban architecture, abandons a lot of these traditional elements. And the result has been that we have people who ask to get married not in the church. They come to a Catholic priest, a Catholic parish, and ask to get married as Catholics, but they don't want to get married in the church. We don't have this problem, for example, with the Shrine of St. Joseph or the Old Cathedral. People come to those places to get married because they are beautiful. But we have abandoned these principles of beauty in our architecture. And it's caused people, it seems to me, and not just to me, but to others, that this is a cause, actually, of people abandoning the spaces of liturgical worship. In fact, as you pointed out, the church is supposed to, in a certain way, replicate or symbolize the garden. And now we have people who prefer to have Mass outside than within the walls of the church, despite the fact that wind is a problem, rain is a problem.
And so is extreme heat.
They would rather have church outside than in the church, which is an absurdity, and it demonstrates some of the absurdity of these modern experiments in liturgical and ecclesial architecture. They're failed experiments in the end.
I want to go back then, because with the sacred architecture representing nature, we then see that it is this perfect harmony with the sacred. So we need our senses to worship God. Mm-hmm. So I want to get one more element of this sacred architecture with the acoustics. The reverberations in a way that's harmonious means it doesn't sound like you're in a tin shed. It doesn't sound like you're in a mall building. But rather, when voices that are beautiful and in harmony fill the church, it actually helps us recognize a reality through the senses that we actually cannot sense, and namely that we are even joining the angels in singing praise to God.
Right. I like to point out that there weren't electric lights and there weren't microphones up until the 1900s, and yet there were still great preachers. There were still great festivities. So these things were possible without them. You've noticed, you're much more sensitive to this, I think, than many people are, that microphones actually damage our ability to have audio concourse. They actually harm us. Think, if you're finding it hard to understand how that happens, think of being in an airport terminal and how you're just bombarded with sound all of the time, and it is annoying, more than annoying. It's actually damaging to you. Microphones in churches usually indicate that the church itself is built badly, because you don't need a microphone in order to be heard in a well-built building.
And I think this is something that I think young families are already picking up on this. Their kids cry more often or are more restless around this kind of cacophony of sound, whereas sacred music actually helps order the soul and put us more at peace. Did children still cry in churches with sacred architecture? Of course. But we shouldn't actually exacerbate the problem,
Right.
but we're actually trying to help these young families with kids.
I'd like to finish with a point that this might seem a little bit. I hope that we've caught your attention and explained some things in ways that make sense to you. But it might still seem a little bit esoteric. It might seem a little bit subtle, or I don't know if I really agree with that. But the important thing to remember, especially with the arts, is that the ones who are the most sensitive to it, the artists, are the ones who have the best sense of the thing. And the artists are the ones who were able to sense the reality of this sacred architecture and the beauty that ought to be part of it. So you and I may not be able to articulate exactly why this or that element is necessary or beneficial to us. And yet, when we're in a place that demonstrates it, we just feel the truth of it, right? There's a reason that we go on pilgrimage and we want to see places, even non-Christians want to see places like Chartres Cathedral or Notre Dame or St. Peter's Basilica, and they're not coming to suburban parishes, churches in America.
Right. Actually, Bishop Barron, with his Catholicism series, he didn't shoot them in as you say, the suburban modern church.
He put them in the grand places of great beauty of our tradition. So sacred architecture matters, and we ought to pursue it.